It was supposed to be a closed-door economic summit. Washington, D.C. High ceilings, guarded elevators, filtered press. Inside the Treasury building, the air itself felt curated, thick with the scent of old money and new ambition. Sunlight, sliced thin by security blinds, fell across a mahogany table polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the stark divide between the two men seated at its head. On one side sat Scott Bessent, the newly appointed Treasury Secretary. He was a man forged in the crucibles of Wall Street, calm, calculated, and dressed in a suit that was less a piece of clothing and more a statement of intent. He had spent his career orchestrating markets, managing billion-dollar hedge funds, and pulling strings most people didn't know existed. To him, the world was a complex but ultimately solvable equation, and the dollar was its universal constant. Across from him sat Ibrahim Traoré. The world had labeled him young, defiant, radical. But in the sterile silence of this room, he looked every bit a man who had seen empires come and go and wasn't impressed by either. He wore no suit, just a simple, dignified grand boubou, its fabric telling a story of heritage, not wealth. He didn't carry the weight of an empire, but the gravity of a continent. His stillness was his armor, his silence a question. Bessent began, smoothing a tie that didn't need smoothing. The gesture was a small performance of control. "Mr. President," his voice was smooth, patronizingly patient. "Let's be honest. Your nation's progress, its stability, it runs on our reserves, our aid, our systems. The framework we provide allows you to participate in the global economy." Traoré didn't blink. He just stared, his gaze holding Bessent's, waiting for the performance to end and the truth to begin. Feeling the need to press his advantage, Bessent leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the kind used to seal a deal or deliver a threat. "You depend on our money." Silence followed. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. The American aide beside Bessent shifted uncomfortably. The very air in the room tensed, waiting for the inevitable concession. Then, Traoré leaned forward slowly, the polished table reflecting his unwavering expression. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was heavy, carrying the weight of the earth itself. "And you," he said, "depend on our ground. Power has a sound. Sometimes it's the thunder of a stock market floor. Other times it's the silent stroke of a pen signing a nation into debt. But on this day, in a room scrubbed of all noise, power was the almost inaudible click of a door sealing two men and two futures from the rest of the world. What was said in that room was never meant to leave its walls, and it would go on to shake the foundations of our global system. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your thoughts on what real power is. Now let's step inside. The silence in that room held for 3 days. In Washington's corridors of power, it was a forgotten echo, a minor diplomatic friction already being smoothed over by aides and archived in confidential memos. But silence, like a vacuum, cannot last. On the 4th day, the world broke it. It came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper that grew into a roar. An anonymous whistleblower released a 38-second audio recording, muffled, clipped, yet clear enough to ignite a firestorm. The clip captured the raw heart of the confrontation. Bessent's voice, sharp with condescension. "It's a child playing with gasoline." Traoré's voice, cold and steady. "Then maybe it's time the fire reached your banks." The internet erupted. Major news networks tried to stay neutral, framing it as a diplomatic dispute. But social media had no such restraint. Within hours, hashtags were trending globally. Hashtag ground over money. Hashtag Traoré versus Treasury. In Ouagadougou, students marched through the streets, not with anger,
but with a renewed sense of purpose. Their cardboard signs proclaiming in bold letters, "Our minerals, our rules." Meanwhile, in D.C., the Treasury Department scrambled not to address the issue, but to contain the fallout. Bessent didn't deny the leak. In his world, you never denied, you reframed. In an emergency press briefing, flanked by flags and economic charts, he doubled down. "We respect sovereign nations," he stated, his gaze fixed on the camera. "But fiscal discipline is not optional. You can't dig pride out of the ground and call it currency." It was meant to sound firm, strategic, a splash of cold water on a heated moment. It backfired badly. The next morning, Traoré released his response. It wasn't a speech or a press conference. It was a single page, published simultaneously in The Guardian, Le Monde, and the New York Times. The title was a blade. "You can't eat interest." The text was devastatingly simple. When your loans come due, you ask for meetings. When our people go hungry, you offer seminars. You speak of fiscal discipline while our soil pays your dividends. We are done trading lives for ledgers. That was when the financial markets, the true arbiters of global power, took notice. Burkina Faso's mining partners, multinational corporations with no allegiance to anything but profit, began quietly renegotiating their terms, not with Washington, but directly with Ouagadougou. Behind the closed doors of Wall Street, the whispers grew louder. Is he bluffing? The answer came back from a veteran commodities trader, a man who understood value beyond spreadsheets. No. He's betting on something we never priced in: dignity.
Markets love confidence, but what happened next shook it to its core. In the week following Traoré's letter, resource-linked ETFs began to fluctuate, minor at first, but erratic, too erratic for comfort. Investment firms called emergency meetings. Washington's Treasury Task Force issued memos marked sensitive, eyes only. The ground, once a stable asset on a balance sheet, was now a variable, a risk, and Scott Bessent, no longer calm, requested a meeting, not in private, but on the record. He wanted a summit in New York, public, televised. It was a high-stakes gamble to reclaim the narrative. The invitation was extended. Traoré's response came in a single sentence: yes, on one condition. No podiums, no protocols, just two men, two chairs, and one truth. On the day of the summit, the UN chamber buzzed like a stock floor. Global CEOs, diplomats, and journalists all came, not for policy, but for a reckoning. They wanted to see the man who had rattled the world with a single page. Bessent entered first, suited in steel gray, flanked by aides and economists. He moved with the rehearsed confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. He was the system personified. Traoré walked in second. He was alone. No papers, no tablet, no entourage. He carried only a plain brown folder in his hand, the kind you'd find in any school office. On it, 3 words were written in simple black ink: where it comes from. The moderator, a respected economic journalist, opened with a sharp question for Bessent. "Mr. Secretary, do you believe Burkina Faso needs the US dollar to survive?" Bessent nodded, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. Not just Burkina Faso, the world. He turned his gaze toward Traoré, his voice laced with the finality of a verdict. "You can have your ground, but without global capital, it's just dirt." The room froze. It was a brutal, dismissive blow. Traoré didn't flinch. He simply placed the brown folder on the table and opened it. Inside were not documents, but satellite images, dozens of them. Mining sites, vast and sprawling, shipping routes, a complex web stretching across oceans, contract logs, signed by Western firms. Then he spoke, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tense silence. "You call it dirt," he began, holding up an image of a lithium mine. "But your jets run on this dirt. Your hospitals store life-saving energy in this dirt. Your semiconductors," he held up another image, "are etched with this dirt." He looked up from the images, his eyes finding Bessent's across the table. His voice didn't rise, yet it filled the chamber. "So the next time you call it just ground, try going a week without touching it." Gasps, then silence. And in that silence, the illusion cracked. The unspoken rule that money always outranked matter, that signatures outweighed soil. Ibrahim Traoré hadn't come to fight a man. He had come to remind the world of a truth it had paid to forget.
Power, when its illusions are shattered, does not turn to introspection. It turns to its tools. Washington's frustration boiled over. The summit, meant to be a public reassertion of dominance, had become a global platform for Traoré's doctrine. Bessent needed to box him in, to remind him that even the most profound truths could be starved by economic reality. So they turned to their most reliable tool, the sanction. A formal notice was issued, the language cold and clinical. Effective immediately, sanctions will be placed on mineral exports originating from Burkina Faso, citing instability in regulatory compliance and nationalization concerns. In the cold print of international law, it was a procedural measure. In the language of power, it was a warning shot. The goal was clear: remind Traoré that the dollar still had teeth, and those teeth could bite. The world watched, expecting a response, a protest, a condemnation. They got silence. Traoré didn't hold a press conference. He didn't tweet. He didn't even acknowledge the sanction. Instead, he boarded a plane. While Washington's analysts were modeling the economic impact of their sanctions, Traoré was flying, first to Istanbul, then to Shanghai, then to Brasilia. In each capital, he met with energy ministers and trade officials. The meetings were off-camera, with no media present. He wasn't performing for the West anymore. He was building with the rest. By the time he returned to Ouagadougou, 3 things had happened. 1. China had agreed to fund and fast-track a railway from Burkina Faso's southern mines straight to West African ports, creating a new artery for his nation's resources. 2. Turkey had committed to building a state-of-the-art mineral processing plant on Burkina-based soil, staffed and managed by local engineers. And 3. Brazil announced a formal proposal for a new trade bloc with African minerals at its center, designed to operate outside the US dollar. Washington was stunned. Wall Street whispered in confusion. How did he move that fast? Where's his economic advisor? Who's writing his strategy? The answer was simple. He wasn't playing their game. He was building his own board. Only then, with the new foundations already setting, did Traoré finally break his silence. He appeared on national television, not from a podium, but from a simple office. He looked directly into the camera, his expression calm, his voice steady. They told us the world had only one gate. When we chose to walk our own path, they tried to lock it. So we built new roads. They thought sanctions would silence us. They only reminded us to speak to different ears. The sanctions were meant to be a cage. Instead, they had become a key.
An old lion, when cornered, doesn't learn new tricks. It only roars louder. Washington, having failed to isolate Traoré economically, turned to its final weapon, public humiliation. A global resource oversight committee was hastily assembled, a televised hearing designed not for discovery, but for indictment. They extended a formal invitation, expecting him to decline and be branded a coward. He didn't. He showed up early. The chamber was a theater of power, all flags and stern-faced interrogators. The chairman, Senator Holt, leaned into his microphone for the first blow. Mr. Traoré, do you understand the economic risk you are imposing on your own people by rejecting dollar-based frameworks? Traoré smiled, a calm, unbothered expression. Senator, he replied, his voice clear and steady, do you understand the risk you have imposed on ours for decades by forcing them? Silence. Another congressman jumped in, his tone sharp. Do you really believe your minerals can sustain your economy without Western finance? Traoré leaned closer to the mic. You don't finance our minerals. You finance your control over them, and we are correcting that invoice, starting now. He then pulled a single document from his coat. It was a copy of a 1998 U.S.-Africa mineral agreement, long buried in legal archives. He laid it flat for the cameras to see, its terms detailing revenue splits where African nations received less than 3% of the profits from their own ground. This, he said, his voice ringing with moral clarity, is your idea of partnership. This is theft in a suit. The screen cut to the stunned faces of the committee. An aide was caught whispering off mic. Who gave him that document? Traoré heard him. We found it, he said plainly. It was lying just beneath your confidence. By the end of the hearing, it wasn't Traoré who looked isolated. It was the panel. 1 year later, Scott Bessent stood before the World Monetary Forum in Zurich. The crowd was younger, more skeptical than in years past. Midway through his speech, he paused. I once told a leader, "You depend on our money," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of experience. But I now realize it is we who have depended on a silence that no longer exists. There was no applause, only a deep, profound stillness. Later that evening, Traoré gave his own address, remotely, from a classroom in Ouagadougou. He stood before a blackboard, beside students in school uniforms. We were told progress comes from following systems, he spoke softly. But systems built on imbalance do not lead, they extract. We are not leaving the table. We are just bringing our own chairs. With that, he closed the laptop. The camera zoomed out, not on a palace or an army, but on a map behind him, marked not with borders, but with resources, rivers, and soil. The real lines of power finally being drawn by the people who lived on them. In the end, there was no war, no regime change, just a quiet, irreversible correction. This wasn't a story about one man defeating another. It was about a simple, undeniable truth reclaiming its place in the world. That wealth is not printed in treasuries, but pulled from the earth. While one man spoke the language of credit ratings and contracts, the other spoke in the language of minerals, memory, and meaning. He didn't beg for respect. He simply revealed its price. If this story resonated with you, please help it reach others. Like this video to show your support. Share it with those who need to hear this message, and comment below with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.